Dawn came up cold and metallic on the prairie of Kestrin 4, a place where the grass grew in silver blades and the wind smelled faintly of rain and hot iron. Jace Rowan moved through it like he'd been issued to the landscape. Quiet boots, careful breath, eyes making notes the way other men kept ledgers. He checked his line of snares the same way he checked his rifle without hurry, and with the patience of someone who liked his meals earned more than bought. The fourth snare sang before he saw it. Wire under tension has a voice, a high, uncertain hum that tells you the difference between a branch and a heartbeat. This was heartbeat. He parted a screen of frost reeds and felt the day fall out from under him. Not a ridgeback hare, not a night stag, a dragon alien, yes, but undeniably, dragon no larger than a farm dog, dappled bronze and ink, one wing cinched cruelly by his line. The hatchling's crest lay flat against a skull too big for its neck, pupils nailed to slits, every breath a shuddering ledger entry against pain. The wire had cut a shallow groove in the soft membrane at the wing's leading edge. One more panic lunge, and the little fool would tear it clean. Jace holstered the rifle in the grass, so there would be no argument about intentions. He showed both hands, palms out. The universal truce. The dragon hissed anyway, a sound more frightened than fierce. Jace kept his voice low and shaped it round so it would roll instead of cut. "Come here, little alien dragon, let me help you." He said it like a promise, not a plan. The words seemed to slow the morning by a fraction. He took a knee and examined the knot he'd tied the night before. That tidy hunter's hitch that was perfect for hares and perfectly wrong for miracles. He always sharpened his knives. Now the habit looked like foresight. Blade flashed, stopped, breathed with him. He snipped the standing part of the line, without letting the wire recoil. The dragon flinched hard enough to say, blur, and the snare sang higher. Jace let the moment pass in silence, and pressed his wrist against the cord, so the vibration would dampen instead of echo. Up close, the little thing smelled of warm stone and furnace dust. Up close he could see that the scales weren't uniform armor, but a mosaic flex plates along the barrel, softer coins at the joint, a scattering of luminous freckles down the throat like someone had tried to map a constellation and gotten distracted. The mouth was full of dentistry. The eyes were full of questions. "Easy," he said. "Act easy. I cut, you stay. No lawsuits." He put the knife to wire and didn't rush. He slipped a leather strap between metal and skin. A buffer he wished he'd had the sense to add before sunrise. And shaved the last wrap of snare. As if he were slicing breath in half, the tension let go with a small, startled sigh. The wing sprang a finger's width and then froze, braced by the dragon's own fear. Jace leaned back on his heels and lowered the knife. No sudden noisiness. No victory grin. The prairie listened. The hatchling did too. The crest rose from panic's collapsed state. The pupils widened until they could take the morning back into themselves. A single thread of heat leaked from the corners of its mouth and stitched a black line into the frostgrass. Jace nodded, as if they'd just agreed about something reasonable. "All right," he said softly. "Your turn." He lifted both hands away from the problem and gave the dragon room. The little body trembled, took one step backward, then two forward, as if it had corrected an equation in its head. It shook itself once, a cat remembering to be a cat, and because the universe has a sense of humor, it bumped the top of its head into his knee, like a commuter apologizing to a train door. "Go on," Jace murmured, tipping his chin toward the basalt ridgeline where, more mornings than not, he'd seen adults riding thermals like they owned the sky. Home's that way. The dragon blinked slowly, a double eyelid whisking across gold. It looked at the grass, at the sky, at the snare coiled on the ground like a dead snake. Then it leaned forward and pressed its forehead against his boot with a finality that would have made a magistrate proud. The wind lifted. Curious, far off, something bigger than both of them drew a lazy circle and did not descend. Jace let out the breath he'd been holding since the wire sang, felt the day climb back onto its rails, and realized with a small, exasperated laugh that breakfast had become a project. He had 3 priorities: stop the bleeding, keep the wing from re-tearing, and persuade the small lunatic not to imprint on him any harder than it already had. 2 out of 3 would have to be considered a win. Jace slid his pack into the grass and worked without ceremony. The med roll he kept for his own worst days produced a vial of coagulant powder, a squeeze of antiseptic that smelled faintly of cedar, and a strip of woven bandage meant for human ribs. He warmed the coagulant in his palm until it flowed like mercy and dabbed it along the nicked membrane, counting his touches the way you count steps over river stones. The dragon hissed at the first sting, then held still in a way that suggested intelligence or exhaustion or both. "Good," he said, keeping approval in the low tones you use with skittish foals and scared miners. "Smart of you." He fashioned a brace from his spare sling, a piece of thin carbon strut he'd once intended to become part of a stove, and the stubbornness that had kept him alive this long. The strap cradled the wing's leading edge and pinned it close enough that a panic flap wouldn't undo the morning's work. He checked for pinch with 2 fingers, then with the observation he trusted more than tools. Did the little body's breath change when he tightened? It did not. He tied off, tamped the knot, and let the strap ends hang, down where small teeth couldn't reach them without intent. The dragon watched all this with an auditor's concentration, occasionally flexing a claw as if keeping score. When Jace rinsed his hands at the canteen, the little head followed the arc of water like a sunflower follows noon. He poured a palmful and held it out. A cool tongue, surprisingly narrow, curled water against scales and made quick work of gratitude. Jace refilled, this time into a dented cup he'd inherited from a better hunter and a worse cook, and the dragon drank like a pilgrim who'd negotiated a miracle on a technicality. "Now we talk about leaving," Jace said, standing and gesturing toward the ridgeline again. "The way you point a magnetic needle north to remind it of its job." He took 2 steps back to teach the lesson without turning it into chase. The dragon took 2 steps forward and planted itself where his shadow fell. The logic of a small thing that had decided large shadows were assets. "Not how this works," he told it. "You came from a place that smells like hot iron and old rain. I come from a cabin that smells like coffee and regret. You go that way. I go this." He spread his arms and sidled left, hoping the universal geometry of space would solve what sentiment could not. The dragon pivoted with him like a star tracking a planet, then complicated the problem by hooking a claw delicately into the canvas of his trouser leg so that any departure would drag it like a kite. He looked down at the hookup and then at the bright, unembarrassed eyes looking up at him. Somewhere in his chest a hinge he'd kept rusted on purpose tried to swing open. "Kid," he said, because the word fit and because arguing with fate demanded a little informality, "I hunt alone." The prairie disagreed at once. A distant crackle of brush told him something larger than a hair had moved wrong. An echo of human voices not shouted, but confident floated along the wind's edge. Poachers, most likely, working lines they hadn't set, and debts they didn't intend to pay. News of a hatchling would travel through that kind of company, like gossip in a small town. Jace's instincts ran a quick inventory of his options, and found them wanting. He could spook the dragon into the reeds, and hope it hid well. He could scoop it up and run. But his knees still remembered the last time he'd tried to outrun a skiff. Or he could do what the morning had already started. Accept the disaster and arrange it into a plan. "Right," he said to the little auditor. "New rule. You stay with me until my bad ideas stop being your problem." He lifted the dragon the way he would a nervous hawk. One arm under the barrel, the other supporting the braced wing, keeping claws honest, with just enough pressure to make respect mutual. The weight surprised him, not heavy, exactly, but denser than the size suggested, compacted heat and bone, and a future too stubborn to be light. A dragon went rigid for a heartbeat, then melted with a sigh that warmed his sleeve, and left a little scorch mark that would become later a ridiculous keepsake. He tucked the cup, the knife, and the guilty snare into his pack. He cut the rest of his line and coiled it tight. A promise to himself made tangible. He angled toward the basalt chimneys along the slow river, where stone made better friends than open plains when men with rented courage came shopping. All the while he talked to the creature in a voice he would have denied owning if anyone else had been there to hear it about trail grades and weather lies and why you always taste the wind before you cross it. When he set the dragon down at the edge of a rock shelf so he could scout the creek bend, it did not bolt. It sat beside his boot, braced wing bright with fresh bandage, head tilted in the obvious question of students. He answered with a gesture. 2 fingers to eyes. 2 to the ground, watch. Then move. The little head bobbed as if taking notes for a test it fully intended to pass. Somewhere upriver, a skiff engine coughed and found its tune. Jace drew an arrow and breathed until his pulse slowed enough to be useful. At his ankle, the dragon pressed closer, a small sun borrowing his orbit. He ought to have felt encumbered. What he felt instead was a treacherous steadiness, as if the day had narrowed to something he could actually hold. "Fine," he whispered, mouth crooked, eyes on the bend where trouble would choose a shape. "You can stay for the part where I do something heroic and ill-advised. After that, we renegotiate." The creek made its conversational noise against stone. The wind shifted. Rogue. Cincer. And we neg. The first shadow moved where it shouldn't. Jace exhaled. The bowstring came back. And the morning, which had started with a song of wire, turned the page. The skiff announced itself with the lazy cough of a machine maintained by optimism. Jace put 2 more inches of himself behind a stone, chimney, and eased the bowstring to his cheek. The creek bent there into a narrow throat. Basalt shoulders shouldered in, and the water, annoyed, talked louder. Good for cover. Bad for retreat. 3 men ghosted into view along the opposite bank, all rented bravado and catalog armor. The first wore a visor tuned for heat signatures. The second carried a coil carbine he held like it made him taller. The third dragged a catch net that had seen better ethics. They were not looking for a stag. Wine. Wine. The 33 too. Wine. Wine. They were looking for the story Jace was holding by the elbow. He touched 2 fingers to the dragon's brow ridge stay, and felt the small skull lean into the signal like a question that trusted its teacher. The braced wing quivered but held. "If they run, we let them," he whispered. "If they aim, we complicate." The leader stopped to consult a wrist screen. "Thermal bloom," he said into his mic, and that was Jace's cue. He drew, breathed, and put the first arrow through the viewport of the visor with the courtesy of a man correcting a math error. Plastic flowered. The visor went blind. The man went down swearing like that would teach bullets remorse. The second arrow kissed the skiff's fuel line where it hugged the hull. It didn't explode, not a storybook morning, but it did turn the engine's cough into a wheeze and its forward motion into an argument with physics the skiff promptly lost. The coil gun spat, stitching sparks off basalt. Jace rolled right, came up in a new cleft, and sent his third answer into the coil housing. The weapon screamed and died with the drama of a diva. The netman, child of momentum and habit, spun his throw. Jace stepped into it. His knife bit the rope just enough to redirect the mesh into the creek. The current grabbed the insult and made it a lesson. The net cinched around a boulder and pulled the netman to his knees in a slapstick prayer to gravity. "Asset is mobile," the blinded raider shouted, pointing his money, accusation at a boulder. Jace nearly laughed, and then didn't, because the dragon pressed closer to his boot and made a sound like a kettle remembering to sing. "Breathe with me," he said. Not because the dragon needed the instruction. Its chest already matched his count, but because the phrase made his own hands steadier. He peered over the rock, found the skiff's pilot crawling under his seat to coax the fuel line back to honesty, and sent a fourth arrow into the sand 2 inches from his knuckles. The pilot re-evaluated his job satisfaction. They could have turned it lethal. He didn't. He chose the petty humiliations that teach faster. He plucked a flat stone and skipped it into the skiff's hull with a bright, percussive knock that made every head turn to the wrong problem. Then he rose into the right problem and let them see they'd brought quantity to a quality fight. "Leave the valley," he called, voice even. Because evenness carries further than a shout. If you're back by sundown, you won't be leaving under your own schedules. The blinded one, stubborn, groped for the coilgun corpse and hefted it like a club. He took a step. The dragon, all nerve endings and new rules, puffed a clean line of heat across the man's boot toe. Leather curled. Pride did, too. The man yelped, and something ancient in the basalt enjoyed the sound. "Go," Jace suggested. And this time suggestion wore steel shoes. They went stumbling, tripping over their own equipment, hauling the skiff like a barge toward a friendlier bend. He watched them until the reeds took them back, then lowered the bow and the part of himself that enjoyed being right. The dragon's head pushed under his hand with the insistence of a question that thinks it's an answer. "We're not done," he warned, checking the brace, the nick. The lines along the membrane where tension writes its own warnings. The wound held. The bandage drank a few more breaths of heat, and stayed civilized. From the north, a shadow turned a grown dragon circling, curious but not descending. Jace raised his chin toward the ridgeline again. "There," he said. "Thermals, big family arguments, you'll be happier." The hatchling blinked, looked dutifully at the sky, then at Jace, and sat on his boot until his toes went numb. "You're impossible," he told it, but the words wouldn't put on their anger. He slung his pack, strung a trip line across the path the skiff had taken, and the two of them ghosted along the creek toward the basalt chimneys where wind forgot how to be loud. The dragon moved at his knee like a moon that had completed a complicated calculation and liked the result. They made camp in a basalt alcove that had learned to be a room. A 3-sided shelter with a roof shaped by an old lava tongue, and a floor worn smooth by centuries of indifferent weather. Jace coaxed a cook fire into an obedient circle, the flame tiny by design. The dragon watched as if fire were a relative it hadn't met yet, but had read about and approved of in principle. He boiled water and pretended not to notice a small, intelligent head inching closer to the pot with the very formal curiosity of a scholar. "This is broth," he narrated, "because talking keeps both species honest. You do not stick your face in it until I say yes. If you do, you will learn about regret, and I will learn new vocabulary." He poured a measure into the dented cup. The dragon inhaled it in 3 dignified swallows and licked the rim exactly once, like signing a receipt. Then it nosed his glove as if requesting a subscription. "We are not making this a habit," he lied, ladling another half cup. The dragon took the second helping slower. "The way you eat, when you have decided a place will not vanish while your back is turned." The sky painted itself into evening. Adult shapes circled far off, not approaching, not ignoring, a council meeting whose minutes would be indecipherable to anyone without wings. Jace worked the brace, slack a notch, to account for swelling's willfulness. The membrane looked better than it had any right to. He exhaled the tension he'd been pretending not to store. "All right," he said. "We try again. I point to home. You go." He stood, pointed toward the ridge and its steam-smudged vents, and gave the dragon enough silence to make the invitation serious. The dragon gazed up the slope. One ear frill twitched. It took 3 purposeful steps in the indicated direction. Jace's chest loosened by an inch. The dragon stopped, turned, returned, and placed a paw delicately on top of Jace's boot, as if pinning a permit. "No," he said, almost laughing. "That's not how a compass works." He tried names instead. "Little one," no flicker. "Twig," no respect. "Spark?" The dragon's head tilted. pupils opening to gold. Ash? A polite blink. Kest? The frills fluttered as if the wind had told them a joke. Neary, he tried, stealing a canyon word that meant light on quick water, and the dragon made a soft chuff that sounded suspiciously like, yes, Neary it is, he conceded, as if he had ever been in charge of the decision. The newly named Neary stepped into his shadow and settled there with the commitment of a signed contract. Night tested the edges of the alcove. Somewhere, the disappointed skiff coughed again and went silent. Jace fed the fire 3 more slivers of wood and let the heat write a small weather beneath the rock. Neary leaned until his shoulder met Jace's calf, and then, when that failed to be enough, draped the rest of himself across Jace's boots, like a cat who'd read the manual on foot warming. This cannot be permanent, Jace told the dark. You have a sky, I have a mortgage. The dark did not care. Neither did Neary, who had discovered, with the alarming competence of the very young, the exact tone of chirp that made Jace hand over his last jerky strip without looking like surrender. He woke to a sound he did not enjoy. The clean metallic click of optics focusing. Dawn had not yet signed off on the day, the creek muttered in its sleep. Across the clearing, a lens glittered where no dew should be poachers again, or their clients, the kind who pay others to make their mistakes. Jace stilled the fire with a heel, smudged Nairy's outline with his blanket, and rolled to the lip of the alcove with his bow already half drawn. 2 figures crouched behind a fallen trunk. One scanned, the other texted his courage to a faraway boss. Jace let the first arrow cut the strap on the scanner. The device tumbled into the creek with a sound that will never stop being comic. The second arrow harried the texter's sleeve into the bark in a way that made climbing away cumbersome and humbling. Bad place for a picnic, he said conversationally. Move along while I'm feeling municipal. They moved, tripping, on dignity. Neary's head popped out from the blanket cave and tracked them with the solemn ferocity of a librarian spotting dog ears in a rare book. When the last twig had stopped complaining, Jace muttered a swear so old it drove the chill off his spine and turned back to the dragon. See? He said, crouching. This is why you go to the ridge. Neary leaned forward until his forehead met Jace's palm, and stayed there. The contact was warmer than it had any right to be. There is a particular weight to a choice made by something that owes you nothing. Fine, he said, through teeth, trying not to grin. You stay until you can fly. We get you strong. Then we argue again. He broke camp, with the tidy speed of men, who never trust mornings to behave, slung the pack he'd just promised would remain his, and set out along the basalt spine toward a gulch only he and the wind had mapped. Neary trotted at his heel, matching his pace without being taught, pausing when he paused, ignoring when he ignored. The ridge to the vents waited, patient as geology. The world would get its say. For now there was a man, a hatchling, and a page of the day that had decided they were a sentence together, whether they liked grammar or not. By noon the basalt spine had softened into a quilt of gullies, each stitched with frostgrass that hissed when the breeze remembered to be teeth. Jace chose the gulch that did not advertise itself, the one whose entrance was an argument between 2 leaning boulders and a dead juniper that had the good manners to fall in the right direction. He taught Neary the shape of moving quietly palm down for low, 2 fingers for pause, and the hatchling, scholar in scales, absorbed the grammar as if it had been waiting for someone to hand him conjugations. They found sign of the wrong kind of men ritualized into the landscape. A length of fiber line snagged on thorn, a spent heat puck still warm enough to lie, and at the bend where the creek forgot itself and ran uphill for 3 breaths, an iron badge stamped with a skull balancing a ledger. He turned it over in his palm, annoyed at how cheaply malice branded itself, and slid it into a pocket meant for receipts. Proof keeps liars short, he told Neary, who nose-tapped the badge and sneezed as if the metal offended on every frequency. The droning came a breath later, a scout drone skimming the canyon seam, its optics set to greedy. Jace flattened a hand. Neary was a statue before the order finished arriving. The drone's lens glittered, tasted heat, and then finding an absence where there should have been a feast drifted downstream in the lazy confidence of outsourced courage. Jace eased a heat pebble from his kit, whisked it on, and rolled it into a clump of reeds where the creek made gossip. The little device pulsed warmth, like a heartbeat, trying to be brave somewhere else. The drone committed to the decoy with the glee of a bureaucracy misfiled on purpose and vanished around a corner to write a report to no one that mattered. They moved again. The gulch narrowed to a throat, and then opened into wind caves the size of good rooms. Inside, the walls had been scoured into curves that made voices behave. Jace used it. He taught Neri the count he taught frightened coonhounds years ago, 2 in, 2 out, and listened with a craftsman's pleasure as the cave gave their breath back tuned. Neri's next exhale had intention in it. The one after that had aim. A soft chime ticked from the far end of the cave. The kind that means someone has convinced a machine to admire its own reflection. Jace slid into shadow and saw the poacher's mark burned into the stone. Nothing subtle. A brand as delicate as a boot heel. Beneath it, a phrase in a courier's hand. Drop .17. The arrogance of advertising coordinates impressed him in a miserable way. He scrubbed the charcoal writing into a smear with the heel of his glove and drew his own mark beside it. An old ranger sign shaped like a broken loop. Trap sprung. Move on. The wind in the cave approved. Or at least ceased complaining. At the next bend, he found the camp the raiders had abandoned too fast for neatness. A ration wrapper. A cracked lens. A half-heart of a boot print, angled wrong. He listened and heard the second skiff out in the broad valley, making the contented noise of a predator that believes its prey subscribed. He should have turned uphill to the vents and their adult protection. And maybe he would have, if Neri hadn't stood rooted. Throat thrumming at a frequency Jace felt in his teeth. The hatchling had discovered a skeleton. Not human, not dog, not any animal licensed by grief. A small dragon. All filigree and emptiness. Ribs like the world had tried to play a harp. It had been dead long enough to be an argument against poetry. Neri approached with the deliberate steps of priests. He set his paw very gently on the skull, and made a sound that bruised the air. Jace did not speak. He found a flat stone, and laid it under the skull. A dais, for a child of a different physics. Then he took the iron badge from his pocket, and set it down on the rock. A bright indictment. The gesture had no legal force. Sometimes, that doesn't matter. "Come away," he said, when it had been long enough for the sound to change shape. "We'll build you a better history than this." Neri followed. Not because he was commanded, but because he had chosen to. On the way out of the cave, he paused at the wall, and burned. With one small ribbon of heat. A neat, clean mark where the courier's brag had been. Not vengeance, exactly. Correction. They camped before sunset in a cleft where the sky couldn't eavesdrop. Jace set up a low reflector to box the fire's warmth, where bodies could steal it, and spun the bandage knot. A finger's width looser as the swelling subsided. Neri took broth like a gentleman, and then, as if remembering the day's ledger, placed half, a beetle carefully on Jace's palm. Payment. Tendered with humor. Jace ate the offering with theatrical solemnity and, because he was not made of stone, snuck Neri a sliver of jerky so thin a saint would have forgiven it. Night arrived, wearing its full catalog of opinions. Out in the dark, the skiff prowled and failed to be patient. Jace sharpened 2 arrows down to needles and fed the fire one more stick. He told a story about earth deer learning to outstare headlights, and how evolution sometimes writes punchlines. Neri listened, like the author. The morning weather had a clean conscience, which is how Jace knew something was going to go wrong. Clear blue. Polite breeze. The sun already pretending it could be trusted. He meant to skirt the ridge and take a slantwise path to the vents that would not confess itself on any map. The ridge meant to be older than him, and did not care about errands. The crack was a sound so thin it might have been imagination. The basalt under his right boot whispered betrayal, and then stopped pretending. The slab tilted. Neri leaped by instinct, and found purchase on a lip that did not promise to remain employed. The braced wing banged rock. The hatchling yelped. Jace reached without thinking and caught a forelimb that could pull his shoulder out if it panicked. It did not. It trembled like a wire did on the worst morning of his life, and waited for his instructions as if he were oxygen. "Hold," he said. And gravity took this as a dare. He loosed the coil of line he carried for stupid slopes, and men who insist on trying them, and threw a loop around a horn of rock that thought it was a saint. The horn held. He wrapped the other end twice around his waist, and 3 times around intention. Then he lowered himself. Boots, feeling for honesty, until he was level with Neri's eyes. "All right," he told a fear he refused to admit to. "We have this." The slab complained, then broke. For a breath, his world was angles and dust. The rope burned a rude line across his palms. Neri slid and scrabbled and would have gone down into the narrow like a note dropped by a clumsy musician if Jace's arm hadn't found a truth it hadn't practiced since a mining collapse a lifetime ago. He got a forearm under the barrel, the other hand crossing to support the braced wing, and took the hatchling's weight into his ribs like an apology he intended to keep. They pendulumed. The rope sang. The horn did its statuary duty. Jace walked them sideways, toes finding grudging nubs, until a vertical seam in the basalt became a carrot the size of a coffin lid. He shoved Neri into it as gently as a man can shove something that should not be shoved, and wedged himself beside. The seam embraced them in the austere way stone does. He breathed once for himself and twice for both of them. "Let's climb," he suggested, as if the day needed permission. He put Neri above him where weight could pull downward into muscle, and not into memory. Step, breathe, set. Step, breathe, set. He pushed the hatchling's haunches when the hind claws searched for a verb. He wore his own breath like armor. Twice the braced wing clipped stone, and twice Jace swore on planets that did not yet exist. Halfway up, voices arrived, small and smug. The cadence of men trying to convince each other their pay was worth what their mirrors said. "Down there," someone said, and tossed a rock to demonstrate gravity to the unimpressed. Jace slid his knife from his boot and flicked it upward. It struck the cliff with a bright clack that answered the thrown rock in a tone any animal could translate as occupied. The men quieted the way amateurs do when they encounter evidence of better amateurs. Their silhouettes moved across the top lip. Careful now. He didn't look up. Looking up complicates priorities. He looked at Neri, who looked back, with pupils blown to the size of good decisions. "Low," he said, which here meant tighter, closer, smaller. Neri folded himself in the seam like a letter meant for one reader. Above, a rope uncoiled, fat and new. A hook squealed along rock, bit, and held. Someone with opinions about himself started down, boots kicking chips, the cordial thunk of expensive gear doing its job for men who wouldn't. Jace did the math and did not like the sum. He had 2 options and 1 arm with blood in it. He chose rudeness. He eased a sonic puck from his inner pocket, thumbed it to the note he remembered Basalt hating, and slapped it against the wall 5 handspans from the hook. "Cover your ears," he told Neri, who had already jammed his frills flat and his head against Jace's shoulder. He pressed the trigger. The rock sang back in a drawer rattle you feel more than hear. The hook, offended, burped out of its crack and went skittering. Above, the climber swore the way men do when they meet impersonal physics. The rope whipped, and a helmeted head appeared for a blink at the lip, stark with annoyance. Then the helmets withdrew, and the sound of feet trying to pretend they had not rushed became the morning's most comforting music. "Up," Jace said when the echoes left. And up they went. The last scramble turned his forearms into knots, and his knees into unedited letters. Neri, discovering the truth of claws, made the top first and turned. Small body coiled in moral outrage at gravity. Jace flopped onto the lip after, and stayed there long enough to remember which joints were negotiable. When he sat up, Nairi was in his lap on principle, and refused to be dislodged. "Fine," he said, letting the universe have this laugh. "But we are not making cliff falling a hobby." He checked the brace again. The membrane's nick miraculously had not reopened, though the gel line he'd laid the first day had gone dull at the edges. He re-gelled, re-wrapped, and pretended not to enjoy the way Nairi leaned his head into the process, as if praise had an address, and this was it. A skiff's engine muttered across the valley, unhappy but persistent. Jace crawled to the edge, peered down, and saw the rope team regrouping around a very expensive device arguing with a very immovable rock. He could have given them the correct angle. He chose literature instead. Scratched a message into the stone with the tip of an arrow. Wrong wall. It would not help them do better. It would help them go away faster. "We move," he said, and movement obliged. They took a switchback path he trusted. Like a farmer trusts rain, he can smell cautious and improvised. At the top of the comb ridge, the vents showed themselves at last, slim geysers writing cursive into the cold air. Adult shapes circled well above, the way judges circle a case they cannot recuse themselves from. Jace steered not directly toward the hot springs where dragons take counsel, but to the derelict weather tower just off the line, a skeleton of girders and welded boxes left by a climate study that had run out of patience and funding. He loved it because it was honest and high, and had corners that cared about men who liked to keep their backs to something. Inside, Dust had been thinking in paragraphs. He kicked a channel through and sat with the hatchling on a grating that warmed from sun alone. Nairi discovered that metal tastes like rain before it becomes rain, and approved. Jace unrolled a strip of mesh and strung it as a windbreak. He did not confess the indulgence of making a place a little like home. He boiled water with the last of the alcohol fuel and made broth thin enough to pass as a promise. Neri took it and, in a display of unearned decency, placed a pebble on Jace's knee as payment, as if economics were a game you play to keep trust visible. From the tower's window, Jace watched the ridge where they'd almost not learned anything today. A pair of tiny figures argued with a rope on the wrong wall. The skiff tried to invent patience and failed. He breathed, more easily than the ledger of the day justified. The wing brace gleamed tidy in the late sun. The hatchling snored once, and then decided he had meant to chuff instead, embarrassed by sleep, and tucked his nose under Jace's elbow to save face. "Tomorrow," Jace said to the vent-plumed horizon, to the adult silhouettes that might, or might not, descend, to the version of himself that had thought he preferred quiet to company. "We try the thermals. We argue with physics, with better manners. And if you still won't go when you can, well, we'll renegotiate in warmer weather." Nairi answered with a small, decisive thump of the tail, against the grating that rattled the tower like laughter echoing up through an old well. Outside, the wind rearranged its clauses. Inside, a man and a dragon acknowledged without paperwork or witnesses that the day had not broken them, or their new grammar. The derelict tower woke in pieces when the wind shifted. Old veins rattled. A rusted anemometer cleared its throat, and somewhere in the girders a forgotten bearing decided to remember its job. Jace liked the sound. Machines that confess their age don't usually lie about anything else. He strung a line of bells made from cut tin along the lee side and set a tripwire low across the gravel ramp, where a skiff would try to nose up. Neri watched the choreography with the keen solemnity of a student allowed into the workshop after hours. They were arguing amiably about breakfast. Jace's thesis. Soup again. Nairi's counter-argument. Jerky by right of cuteness. When the wind carried them, a voice riding a cheap loudhailer. Hunter, it called, pleased with its own echo. Kindly return Imperial property, and we'll overlook your paperwork. Paperwork, Jace repeated, savoring the sheer gall. He leaned out the broken window and saw them, a sand skiff idling below like a lazy crocodile, 4 men in catalog armor, and a 5th, whose coat tried to be a uniform and failed. The coat held the loudhailer. The loudhailer held a man whose haircut had cost a bounty and a conscience. Behind them, 2 scout drones sat on their skids like obedient dogs pretending not to be bored. Jace took stock the way he always did: angles, exits, humiliations available. Low, he told Nairi, tapping the floor. The hatchling folded into shadow and tucked the braced wing tight. His frills flattened, not in fear, but in comprehension. Progress. Last chance, the loudhailer proclaimed. We're generous when people are sensible. Congratulations, Jace murmured, to nobody in particular, on discovering a sentence that has never been true. He pulled a spool of copper wire from a pocket that had once held better days and clipped one end to the tower's lightning rod. A pitted spear that still pointed at weather, with hope, and the other to a rusted bolt on the lowest girder. Then he set a metal pan in the gravel ramp and coiled the last, length like a loose question inside it. Down below, the man with the haircut made a magnanimous gesture and sent one of his drones forward to scout. Non-lethal net, he told his crew. We want the asset intact. Jace winked at the old wind vane. Asset. Listen close. He lifted the wooden lever that married the lightning rod to the tower's rusted bones. Current didn't leap clear morning, but capacitance is a quiet trickster. The rod grudgingly surrendered the last charge of dawn to the copper, and when the drone's skid kissed the pan, the spark that jumped was small, petty, and exactly insulting enough to matter. The drone yelped in machine language and sat down hard. Its twin swooped heroically and found the same pan. The sand skiff's crew had a brief, chaotic conference with gravity. Cover your ears, Jace said to Nairi, who folded his frills on a reflex that made Jace's ribs loosen. He thumbed a sonic puck to a note Basalt disliked and slid it down the stairwell until it bounced into the gravel just shy of the skiff's prow. The puck sang. The gravel shivered and forgot what small rocks are for. The skiff settled nose first into a friendly slump, engine still running, dignity abruptly unemployed. The loudhailer tried bluster again and found itself copying consonants around the sudden acoustics of embarrassment. Hunter, it said, fracturing. This is improper. Improper, Jace agreed. Is a ladder you need when the ground is trying to hand you a lesson. He drew, breathed, and sent an arrow through the loudhailer's cone so gently it only died after a dignified feedback squeal. The man with the haircut flinched so hard his fashion regretted its choices. A coil gun came up. Reflex before thought. Jace didn't bother with the weapon. He stitched 2 arrows into the skiff's canopy legs instead, turning the gunner's cover into an obligate yoga pose. New proposal, he called. Pleasant as a weather. Report. You collect your paperwork, you take your very expensive pan-resistant drones, and you leave this valley before the wind learns your names. The youngest of them, all elbows and fury, raised his net thrower. He never got the cast off. A clean, delicate ribbon of heat stitched from the tower window down the ramp, and drew a bright, black line across his boot toe. Leather curled, the boy danced. Everyone else forgot, briefly, how to be brave. Nairi tucked the flame back into his chest with the exact air of a student returning a textbook to the shelf. Jace permitted himself a private smile. They might have tested their luck longer if the tower hadn't decided to help. The old anemometer, spun up by a cooperative gust, began to sing at just the frequency that makes human nerves question their life choices. One man clapped a hand to his ear. Another misstepped and planted himself shin-deep in the gravel slump. The man with the haircut, who had likely never belonged to a day that refused to salute, took one incredulous look at physics, misbehaving, one resentful look at Jace, and cut his losses with the reluctant grace of a gambler paying a debt. Asset or not, he snapped, kicking the drone upright with a boot that would later remember the insult. This valley isn't worth the invoice. Jace doffed an imaginary hat. I concur. They left in the special disorder that only expensive failure produces no one running. Everyone pretending not to mind that they were going, and Jace waited until the wind ate their noise before lowering the bow. The sonic puck hiccuped itself hoarse and died. The old tower, having executed its good deed for the semester, settled back into comfortable ruin. Nairi uncoiled from shadow and bumped Jace's knee as if to submit a post-operation report. Jace crouched, checked the brace, found the gel seam holding with a stubborn neatness he adored, and scratched the place just behind the jaw where praise translates, without vocabulary. Nairi's eyes lowered in pleased embarrassment. The frills, traitors, fluttered. Lunch. Jace proposed to the room that had briefly hosted an army. Then we run. He didn't mean fleeing. He meant the science of not being where someone who deserved to fail expected you to be. The hatchling, who had never been to school but understood curricula all the same, chirped agreement and stole the last shard of jerky as if signing an attendance sheet. Running, properly done, has the elegance of a theorem. Jace folded the tower behind them and slipped into the quilt of gullies he trusted, like the palm lines in his own hand. He let the wind choose their alleys, reading the lay of frostgrass for recent arguments, and avoiding the ones that had drawn conclusions too neatly. Neri stayed a step off his knee, learning the changing vocabulary of terrain low for silence, pause for audit, now for joy, withheld until it counted. The skiff's engine ghosted the valley. Behind them mended, sulking, unwilling to confess its coming mistakes. Jace accounted for arrogance and set his lures. First, heat the wrong way. He thumbed 3 pebble warmers to life and tucked them into a string of reed clumps along the creek like a trail of little beating hearts that went someplace that did not exist. The drone that had recovered its faith in employment would see the line and tell a cheerful lie to its masters. Jace felt only slightly guilty about abusing a machine's optimism. Second, smoke honest and dishonest at once. He poured a finger of fuel into a dented tin cup, lit it, then slid the flame under the lip of an overturned drum lodged in the choke of a gully. Air went in stingy. Smoke came out generous and low. A creeping gray river that made men cough, and optics assume the world had become less interesting. He set another under a rock shelf where the draft would carry the plume in a bend. Traps that kill take no skill to build. Traps that humiliate, those require craft. Ears, he warned, though the pucks in his pocket would stay silent today. Neri preemptively flattened his frills anyway, which is what preparation looks like when you are born with excellent equipment. They moved with their shoulders brushing stone, feet whispering in old dust. Twice Jace paused to let Nairi relearn the brace with a slope, adjusting the tension a thumb width so the wing didn't fight the path. The hatchling accepted each correction with the grave patience of a kid who knows the test will be written by physics, not parents. A figure burst where the gully jolted left, wild-eyed, lungs filing complaints. He wore the remains of a net thrower like an unfortunate bandolier, and improvised bravery in the absence of good sense. He saw Jace and saw prey. He saw Neri and saw a ledger entry. He raised something that had once been a weapon and was now a handle attached to work. Jace did not do him the courtesy of drama. He stepped inside the swing, turned the handle into a lever without malice, and returned the man to the ground with that particular collapsing sound pride makes when it meets geometry. Professional advice, Jace offered. Breath low. When the valley tells you, no, stop asking it to repeat itself. The man blinked, tears, smoke, or humiliation, both medicinal and fled in the graceless way. Good lessons, often in code. The skiff chose the wrong fork, as predicted by human nature, and plowed into the first smoke pocket, without suspicion. Coughing ensued. Someone swore at a drone for reporting the truth too late. Jace shepherded Nairi up the spine of a ridge and across a knife of rock thin enough to make recklessness useful. On the far side, a basalt arch broken once by weather and again by time offered a room with a view and a ceiling that wouldn't rat them out. They settled under it and let their lungs decide what they believed. The skiff, chastened, coughed itself to a stop somewhere the map would label unwise. The wind veered. Smoke thinned. A hawk tried on a circle and put it back. Jace stretched aching fingers and discovered he'd added 3 new cuts to the day's ledger. He washed them with water, the temperature of opinions, and didn't bother pretending they wouldn't smart later. Nairi inspected the wounds with the ceremonial sobriety he brought to everything Jace hadn't planned for. He touched each slice with the tip of his tongue, warm, careful. A little scandalized by human design, and then nosed the bandage roll, as if recommending more respectable architecture. Noted, Jace said, wrapping neat and firm. Next time I'll bring different skin. They ate a dinner that would offend chefs and comfort saints. Broth. Earned thin, a jerky shard that pretended to be larger. Nairi made a formal presentation of half a roasted beetle he had found and disapproved of. Jace accepted it with theater, chewed with a dignity he did not feel, and slid the hatchling a more civilized scrap in return. Economy, at last, had stabilized. Night arranged itself around the arch in sentences rather than proclamations. Out across the basin, adult silhouettes rode the vents in long, sweeping judgments. None descended. None declared. Jace loosened the brace 1 notch to account for healing that had decided to cooperate and checked the nick along the leading edge of the membrane. Pink now. Not angry. The gel seam took light, like a signature drying. Tomorrow we try the lip of the thermals, he said, naming the future so it wouldn't wander off. Just the lip. We argue with lift the polite way. Nairi pressed his forehead into Jace's palm for a long, quiet moment, then settled across his boots with the entitlement of creatures who have chosen their constellation and plan to stick with it. The weight grounded more than feet. It pinned in place an admission Jace hadn't yet said aloud. He did not, in fact, prefer the kind of quiet he'd lived in before. Wind hummed through the arch's broken stone, making a low chord that rooms learn when families happen. Jace told a story about Earth Deer, who learned to stare down headlights by inventing patience faster than cars could invent speed. About how evolution sometimes writes jokes because the alternative is crying. Nairi listened with attentive gravity and, at the punchline, made a small sound that wasn't a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. Somewhere to the east, the skiff finally gave up trying to locate a version of the valley that would cooperate and turn tail with the stubborn whine of men who would tell the story differently in bars. The arch, having heard enough, relaxed. Jace slid his hand to the hinge of Nairi's jaw, the way he always ended the day now, and felt the warm, precise machine of breath move under scales and skin. He matched it without thinking. Tomorrow, he repeated to the roof of rock. The indifferent stars. The adult shapes that would judge more kindly than he expected. We try up. If you still won't leave, we'll renegotiate in the language of spring. Nairi thumped his tail against the stone once. An editorial with excellent prose, and the sound traveled up into the arch and came back as something that very much wanted to be laughter. The vents wrote pale cursive into the cold. Each plume a column where the planet remembered to be generous. Jace chose the smallest, a timid boil at the edge of the field, and paced its breath until he could count the beat in his feet. Nairi sat on the lip like a scholar at the edge of a metaphor. Frills angled. Braced wing unstrapped. The membrane pink where it had been angry, and now was only an old story told well. We don't climb yet, Jace said. We visit. He held his hand over the heat and showed how a palm finds. Lift. Dip. Feel. Withdraw. Again. Nairi mirrored him, claws flexing, nostrils flaring at the metal tang in the steam. On the 4th pulse, the hatchling leaned into the upward push and let it take a fraction of weight. His body argued. Physics answered in the tone of an elder who has seen this before. Jace jogged a circle around the vent, clapping softly to keep the rhythm honest. Nairi hopped a small, brave punctuation, and the vent underlined him with air. He rose the height of a man's hand and landed, surprised at the world's willingness. 2nd hop. Higher. 3rd. Higher still, a glide as long as a held breath, landing with a skitter of claws and a look over his shoulder that said this might become habit. Far above, adult shapes held their distance, riding the long thermals like a jury that had agreed to hear the case. One left its lane, banked, and drew a spiral down until its shadow briefly draped Jace and Nairi under the same wing. The elder's scales were slate and smoke. Old scars cut tidy lines across the leading edge. It did not descend to claim or correct. It hovered in place. Nose pointed into the same. Wind, Jace was counting. And rolled its wrist once an unmistakable, elegant instruction to match. Okay, Jace murmured. Show-off has a point. He moved to the vent's shoulder and angled his body the way the elder had, hips square, chest forward, weight biased to the foot the wind wanted anyway. Nairi tracked both of them, then committed. One clean bound, membranes open. Ribs surprising him with their own architecture. Air lifted. Gravity sulked. The ground took a respectful step back. Jace walked alongside, a shepherd to an animal that would never be herded, keeping the count so steady that even nerves could not pretend to forget. The fourth pass was not a hop. It was a glide, true and brief, a line across a page the hatchling had learned to read. He rose, flattened, rode the couch of warm air until it cooled, and touched down with a chirp that had more vowels than the species probably intended. Jace allowed himself a grin so fast it was practically stealth. Then, the wind, traitor to perfection, shifted. A cross-gust, from a larger plume, bullied the small vent into a lopsided heartbeat. Nairi set for the hop and found his feet late. One wing caught the dirty edge of lift. The world tilted. Jace was already moving. Hand up, voice at the count, turning panic into math. 2 in, he said, matching the elder's roll with a human imitation. 2 out. Nairi's chest listened, before his eyes did. He trimmed with a flick of belly and shoulder he hadn't owned an hour ago, corrected, glided crooked and true, and landed in a spray of frostgrass like a champion who had just learned gravity was a debating partner, not a cop. The elder dragon rumbled approval that Jace felt in his molars. It dipped a wing toward the high vent's invitation, not summons, and then, with the dignity of judges who decline to sentence, rose back into its circuit. Jace ridiculous mammal saluted it with 2 fingers and a nod as if anyone but the wind understood. He rechecked the seam along Nairi's leading edge. The scar took sunlight the way water takes coin. You can, he said, meaning fly. The air had already answered. Now's the part where you decide. He stood back and pointed toward the column where adults carved their essays. Nairi looked. He raised his nose. He tasted iron and salt, and family a history big enough to drown a small thing, and patient enough to teach him how to swim. Then he turned and pressed his forehead into Jace's palm, like a document being countersigned. You've seen that you can, Jace translated. Because sometimes you say the obvious out loud so it can be praised. You still pick me. A shape left the high traffic and spiraled lower. A different adult. Young by the look, bold by the angle. It hovered 10 meters off, studying the ridiculous tableau. A human with wind-burned knuckles. A hatchling with intelligent eyes. A vent making room for all of it. The young one dropped a single scale, small as a thumbnail and black as rain on slate. It clicked on rock and lay there, like a coin struck by time. Nairi stepped to it, bumped it once with his nose, then picked it up and set it deliberately on Jace's palm. Jace closed his fingers around the cool gloss of it, let his hand rest on Nairi's skull, and felt the world redraw a border he had not known he cared about. Then we write a different map, he said. The wind agreed. It smoothed out again and made a soft corridor through the vents, as if offering a door to whichever future they chose. The valley gave them an hour of grace and then, because stories rarely resist circles, sent the market back to collect on its pride. The skiff came from the east with its cowling patched and its patience exhumed. Two drones flanked. Not scouts this time, but net carriers with thermal shields and the kind of software that learns the wrong lessons from last week. On the prow, a new man in a new coat carried a harpoon launcher, rigged with a tether and the unmistakable smell of contracts. Jace saw the shadow first, moving where it shouldn't, and felt the day tense. He tapped Nairi's jaw count, and the dragon's chest found the rhythm like a musician taking a cue. "We don't give them a straight line," Jace said. "We make them solve our geometry." He ran not away, but across, angling for the seam between two vents, where the ground buckled into a low, dark lip. Nairi floated his knee, braced wing tight, other wing furled in a promise. Out of the pack came one of the last sonic pucks, tuned this time not to shake rock free but to tease steam. He thumbed it to a whisper and slid it into the throat of the smaller vent. The plume fattened, leaned, and merged into its neighbor, riding a veer across air that had been polite a moment ago and now was interesting. The drones dove, smart enough to hold distance, dumb enough to believe distance is safety. Jace knelt and flung a fistful of powdered basalt into the bent steam. A trick he'd learned from a geologist who cooked on geysers and considered optics a hobby. The powder turned the plume into a gray curtain that fooled sensors into reading wall. The first drone turned late and kissed the unseen edge. Its net burped out, caught a geyser lip, and made a wet, insulting noise. The second flared high to help and met a crossboil's updraft that tossed it like a leaf. It recovered with offended efficiency and came in again. But now, its power management had a story to tell itself, about caution. The skiff chose bravado over tactics and charged the notch. The harpoon launcher came up with lazy confidence. Jace felt Nairi's shoulder bump his thigh, asking permission for something he did not have a name for yet. "On now," Jace said. Small. Precise. He scrambled to the windward side of the low lip, set his foot on a buried rock he trusted, and drew a line in the gravel with his boot like a pitcher marking a beset. Mound. The skiff hit the first eddy and skittered. The harpooner swore at air for refusing to hold still, and fired anyway, miss by a finger's width. The tether slapping the ground. The barbed head skipping into steam. Now. Nairi exhaled a disciplined ribbon of heat, not at the skiff, not at men, but at the tether line itself where it snaked, momentarily taut, across the vent's throat. Heat-kissed resin. Tension did the rest. The tether snapped with a bright, surprised twang. The harpooner stared at his now free cable like a man watching an argument walk away. Jace sent 2 arrows into the skiff's steering vanes, not to hurt, just to make it steer like a boat with opinions. The craft obligingly pirouetted and planted its nose in sediment, soft as cake. A raider on the flank leapt from the skiff and tried heroism. Jace's heel found the trip line he'd set 10 minutes ago and invited the man to test Gravity's customer service department. Gravity, as always, delighted. "Leave," Jace called, not theatrical now, just tired and accurate. "You're out of angles." One of the drones, offended at being eclipsed by human foolery, attempted a high net drop. Nairi flashed 3 steps forward, leapt the way only a creature who had just learned air will catch him can leap, and burned the webbing in a neat X that turned net into ribbon. He landed clumsy, perfect, and chirped at the machine, with such composure, it felt like critique. The man with the coat finally read the room. He slashed the dead tether free, shoved his pilot, and wrestled the skiff out of the cake face with a cough of sand and a shower of bad vocabulary. The drones retreated, promising strongly worded memos to their manufacturers. They limped away, leaving behind a harpoon head steaming in the vent, and a spool of cable that would never invoice anyone again. Jace stood very still while the adrenaline left, never sprinting, just raising the room temperature and then deciding to be elsewhere. Nairi leaned into his leg as if holding him down to the planet he had just decided to belong to. The vents resumed their normal cursive, less dramatic, more honest. Above them, the elder who had taught by example traced a single slow circle, and then, with the economy of teachers who reward without praise, climbed back into the high lanes. Jace retrieved the fallen harpoon head with a stick and tossed it into a pool where it hissed like an embarrassed liar. He collected the snapped tether and coiled it as neatly as he had once coiled snare wire, a habit he would not break on principle. He took the small black scale from his pocket, the coin of approval, and set it on the coil's top like a seal. "All right," he said, voice gone soft in the way voices do when contracts write themselves. "You can fly. I can aim. Neither of us prefers quiet anymore." Neri bumped his forehead into Jace's palm, then discovering he could into Jace's shoulder, a weight as ceremonial as any metal. Jace accepted without pretending he hadn't wanted it. They walked back toward the weather tower, not as fugitives or escorts, but as partners who had just declared a precinct. The wind trailed them with the relieved gossip of work well done. At the tower, Jace tied the snapped tether across the doorway like a ribbon after a grand opening. A quiet joke he did not intend to explain. He strung the last of the cut snare wire into a circle and hung it from a beam where sunlight could give it a job. Ring faintly when interesting weather approached. Neri curled on the grating and watched him with the particular patience of creatures who know their next chapter has a co-author. Jace set the dented cup on the stove, poured broth thin as hope and twice as useful, and took from his pocket the scale the young dragon had given him. He placed it on the ledge above the stove, a promise to remember the day the air said yes. "Tomorrow, we see what the ridge looks like. From higher," he said, already drawing the route on the map the wind kept in his bones. "After that, we teach the valley better manners." Neri thumped his tail once, rattling the tower into laughter. Outside, the vents wrote their endless notes. Inside, a man and a dragon tuned themselves to the same key and let the valley learn the chorus.